When taken together, several things Kathie mentioned in her account of the strange backyard lights and the dead area on the lawn suggested to me the possibility that a UFO landing had taken place, despite the fact that neither she nor her mother remembered having seen anything that could be called a craft. The unusual behavior of her dog is typical of many UFO sighting reports in which dogs, horses, and even cattle seem to be dramatically affected by low-level or landed UFOs. This phenomenon, it has been theorized, may be a reaction to disturbing sound frequencies outside the range of human hearing. Often, the animal continues for a time to be wary of the site where the disturbance took place. The small moving lights that Kathie's mother described have also been mentioned many times before in conjunction with low-level UFO sightings. But the photographs, of course, presented the most graphic evidence in support of Kathie's claim of a drastic, nearly overnight change in the Davises' lawn. The main area was a circle 8 feet in diameter, in which all the grass had turned brown and was now crumbling away. Extending out from this circle was a 49-foot-long swath which ran perfectly straight and was nearly 3 feet in width. Here, too, the grass was dead and disintegrating. This long track ended in a nearly perfect arc and seemed absolutely artificial. 2 smaller jogs appeared to emerge from the main circle, and one of those contained a deep crack which looked, superficially, as if it had been caused by intense heat. The photographs were clear and effectively showed the mysterious damage. But Kathie had still another story to tell. Her letter continued. Now about Laura. My sister Laura is 35 years old. She's always been very level-headed and not much imagination. Always the realist. Anyway, in the summer, about 1965, she left one evening about 4:30 p.m. to take my mother to bingo. On the way home from dropping her off, as she was passing the church on 10th Street, she suddenly was compelled to pull into the church parking lot around back. She noticed there weren't any cars around and thought it quite strange for a Sunday afternoon in that busy area. When she parked, she looked up and saw something she'd never believed before then. It was silver. And I believe she said the lights were red, green, and white, flashing somewhat. Flickering might be a better word. It was hovering soundlessly over the lot about telephone pole high, right over her car. All she remembers now is she reached over to turn down her radio to see if it made noise. And then the next thing she remembers is it's dark out, and she looks up and this thing is gone, and she's driving down the street. When she went to get Mom that night, they drove around looking for it, but never saw anything else. In this brief account of her sister's 1965 experience, Kathie includes 3 intriguing details that turn up frequently in abduction accounts. First, there is the suggestion of external control over the abductee. One simply finds oneself compelled, as Kathie put it, to drive down a particular road, enter a parking lot, leave one's house, or whatever, for no apparent reason. The decision is remembered as odd, even irrational, and frequently a witness will say something like, I didn't even know there was a road there, but I found myself turning off the main route to drive down it. I stopped next to this field, and there was a UFO hovering above the trees. No one knows how this psychic control is enforced, but it is a basic component in many UFO abduction reports. The potential abductee is apparently set up in a place that permits the UFO and its occupants to operate efficiently, safely, and covertly. So far, all the UFO abduction cases I have investigated have had this kind of tactical plausibility, a fact that weighs in on the side of their physical reality. The second and more crucial indication of a possible UFO abduction was the fact that Laura lost a period of time. First, it was about 5 o'clock in the afternoon, and the next thing she knew, it was several hours later, since darkness had fallen. One common characteristic of an abduction experience is the merging in memory of its onset and its conclusion, a joining so seamless as to leave the abductee with no feeling that he or she has actually lost any time, despite what clocks and simple vision may establish beyond any doubt. This partial and apparently externally imposed amnesia can be extremely effective. Laura remembered sitting in her car and looking up at the UFO, but her very next recollection after that was of driving down a street with the UFO no longer in sight. Note: I learned later that Kathie's recollection on this point is slightly in error. See page 20 and note 18 below. It is significant that she reported these odd recollections to her mother that very evening. In 1965, at least a year before the public at large was aware of the symptoms or even the existence of such bizarre events. Note: subsequent interviews with Laura and her mother placed the incident as having occurred in the late summer or early fall of 1965. The Betty and Barney Hill case came to public attention through John Fuller's 1966 book-length study, The Interrupted Journey, a shortened version of which also appeared in Look magazine. The third indication of a possible abduction was, of course, the presence of the telephone pole-high lighted UFO itself, as centerpiece to her recollection. But there was more. In Missing Time, I had described the use of hypnosis in recovering forgotten details in such cases, and I had recounted some of the vagaries of both the method and its results, as it had been employed by the various psychiatrists and psychologists who aided our investigations. Kathie's letter continued, bringing up an event that in this context was particularly interesting. About 10 years or so later, Laura went to get hypnotized to lose weight. And while her girlfriend, who went with her, did great, she experienced some quite terrifying experiences. The first night she came home, after the hypnosis, shortly after she went to bed, she woke up and she couldn't talk or hear. She also suffered temporary distortion in her vision. Her husband took her to the emergency room and they gave her tranquilizers and sent her home. This went on gradually getting better. She noticed that she was doing the exact opposite of what the hypnotist had suggested. He told her that potato chips and candy were fat slices. I guess so it would gross out her subconscious and she wouldn't want to eat them. But instead, every time she ate them, she felt markedly better. And when she called the hypnotist to ask him what the heck was happening to her and could he fix it, the moment she heard his voice, she became violent and wanted to kill him. You have to know Laura. She's very much not like this at all. Very common sense, down to earth, and easygoing. He suggested she had some sort of block and that it would probably be best if she didn't see him anymore, to go to someone else. The effects gradually wore off, but she was left with one strong thought, that by the year 2000, the world would be totally different than what we know it, but it would be only for the young and strong. Having finished her account of the mysterious backyard lights, the marks on the ground, and her recollection of her sister's UFO experience, Kathie added a final cryptic paragraph. My mother and I have had a couple of unusual experiences, mine mostly in the form of vivid dreams, and Mother and I both have the same scar on our right legs. She said she got her scars when she was a girl playing outside. I don't remember when I got mine, but it seems like I had it all my life. They are in the same place and look exactly alike. A nurse once told me it looked like a scar left by a bone marrow test or a pin inserted in my skin bone from a break. At first, I only had one scar, but now I have two on the same leg, about 3.5 inches apart. I got this one when I was about 13, but I can't for the life of me remember how. I used to play in the woods by the pond a lot, and I may have got it there, but I don't remember how. Kathie closed her letter with an address and a phone number. Though I could not anticipate it at the time, her account of 2 suggestive incidents has expanded into the most complex UFO case I have yet encountered. Usually, when I received letters in response to missing time, they were read and then stacked in a cardboard box to be answered later when time permitted, a batch at a time. If the tone of the letter sounded urgent and the narrative followed the pattern of symptoms I recognized as suggestive of a buried abduction experience, I often phoned the writer directly. The Kathie case fit this special category. I called her for the first time on September 15th, 1983. A number of phone conversations ensued, leading up to arrangements for Kathie to visit New York in the middle of October for an intensified investigation of her experience and a series of hypnotic regressions. During these phone calls, I talked with Kathie, her mother, her father, and her sister, Laura. All 4 speak with a familiar Middle American accent. I was born in Wheeling, West Virginia, so I know it well, and an earthly, candid directness that conveys the habit of honesty. One of my first conversations was with Kathie's father, Robert. I asked him his recollections of the circle and patch of dead grass which appeared on the lawn behind his house. Well, I've been working about 10 years on this damn yard out there, and the backyard was the best part of the whole place. I don't know what did it. It's not fungus. I don't know what the devil it is, but something or someone or whatever has wiped out a hunk of my damn ground. The circle and that line away from it is still just like it was, and it's been there about 3 months. It hasn't changed at all. The grass just grows up to it and quits. Robert, Mary, and Kathie all agree that it took perhaps 3 days for the grass to die completely and then to crumble away to brown powder. The marks were unmistakably clear by the 4th of July, when Mary remembered pointing them out to her grandson. Shrubbery near the bird feeder, where Mary had first seen the small ball of light, began to die also. And as we shall see, there were other odd organic changes in the Davises' backyard. I also asked Kathie's father his opinion of both of his daughters' basic truthfulness. Robert and Mary have raised 4 children, 3 girls and a boy, and I have met them all. As I began to know them better, I felt that they all were honest and innocent of the need to embellish or invent exotic incidents. Robert was more emphatic. If they ever made anything up, I'd whack their butts for them. So they never did. In fact, after talking to the other family members, I realized that Kathie had a tendency even to understate the strangeness of events in the Davis clan. She was less prone to sound the alarm than to try to explain things away, and she only wrote to me when she had photographs to back up her and her mother's accounts of the peculiar backyard lights and ground traces. At the end of that letter, she had referred, almost reluctantly, to some vivid dreams she had had, and in one of our earliest phone conversations, I asked her about them. The most recent, and for her the most unforgettable, occurred in the summer of 1978, when she was 19 years old, newly married, and living with her husband in a small attic apartment in a suburb of Indianapolis. The dream was extraordinarily frightening and realistic. Kathie recalled an experience as vivid now as it had been then. It began in the middle of the night with Kathie sitting up, awake, facing 2 strange, gray-faced creatures who stood alongside her bed. One of them was holding a small black box with a glistening red light on its top. The man who held the box moved closer and handed it to Kathie. And as he moved, the other figure moved too, in absolute unison. In an account she wrote later, she described it this way: "When they handed me the box, I remembered thinking, 'Oh, please, don't come any closer.' Just as I wrote that, I felt the terror, and it all felt too real. The feeling, the dream. For just a flash, I thought this could be real. I don't know. The terror is real." She described the figures as having large heads and skin that was dingy white, almost gray. Their eyes were pitch black in color, liquid-like, shimmering in the dim light. She mentioned that she could not remember seeing hands when the box was passed to her, and that the figures were so close to the bed that she could not see their lower legs or feet. "I don't remember if there was a mouth and nose or ears. I just remember the eyes best, and the general shape. They were between 4 and 5 feet tall, I guess, and slight of build. He called me by name and seemed to talk to me like I was a child. I don't know why I feel this, but it didn't bother me. He said, 'Kathie,' and handed me the box. I said, 'Can I have it?' He said, 'No. Hold it. Look at it.' I did, Then he took it away from me gently after a minute. I said, "What is it? What's it for?" He said, "Look at me." Then I thought, do I have to? But I did. He said, "When the time is right, you will see it again. You will remember, and you will know how to use it." I said, "Okay." I was scared, petrified, but as soon as I heard my name, and when I looked at his face, his eyes, I could calm down enough to communicate. I felt more physically relaxed, almost sleepy again, and quieter mentally. I just kept thinking, just don't come any closer and don't touch me, and I'll be okay. God, please don't touch me. Don't move closer to me, please. They never touched me, and they moved slowly, cautiously. I never saw them leave. I just woke up. Kathie said that this dream seemed utterly real. She was in her own bedroom, and everything appeared exactly as it normally was, except for the presence of her strange visitors. Her husband was asleep beside her through the entire ordeal, yet she made no effort to alert him. About 3 a.m., she awoke slowly, as if from an anesthetic, as she put it, and roused her husband to tell him of her bizarre recollection. The following day, she told her mother as well as her sister Laura. I have since interviewed both women, as well as Kathie's ex-husband, on this point, and all three recall Kathie's having told them at that time, 1978, of her frightening dream. All the details she has described predate the publication of Missing Time. She also did not see the film Close Encounters of the Third Kind until her father took the whole family to see it a year later at Christmas time. I am satisfied that in 1978 she had almost no knowledge of the typical bedroom visitation, nor of this commonly reported UFO occupant type. Her images and memories cannot be ascribed either to contamination by reading the UFO literature or by viewing its Hollywood version as created by Steven Spielberg's special effects department. In the past 7 years, I have investigated literally scores of accounts similar to Kathie's dream recollection. And I'm always on the alert for certain symptoms that suggest the dream was not a dream at all, but instead was a real event. Though many UFO abductions are remembered normally and apparently in their entirety, the way one might recall a mugging or a frightening accident, some degree of amnesia accompanies the majority of these experiences. We simply do not know whether amnesia in these situations is a natural, internally fueled defense against unsettling memories, whether it is an externally imposed phenomenon by which UFO occupants conceal their operations and, as it were, help the abductee to live as normal a life as possible after such an experience, or some combination of these two factors. But if, as I suspected, Kathie's dream was a real event, her conscious recollections were undoubtedly only part of a longer, more complex, buried experience. The first thing she remembered was not awakening, but rather being already awake and sitting up in bed. She had only a hazy sense of how the dream ended. So, like a number of UFO abduction accounts, her story had a middle, but no real beginning or end. I made a mental note that when she came to New York, this would be the first incident which we would explore through hypnosis, the method we relied upon to piece the veil of amnesia. In the time between my receipt of Kathie's original letter and the day of her arrival in New York in mid-October, I was on the phone with at least one member of the Davis family almost every other night. UFO research may be frustrating from some points of view, but I'm sure it has the full support of the telephone company. Indianapolis, even in the off hours, is a costly connection, and few of our calls were short. Each of the Davis family members' recollections seemed to spark still more accounts of other apparently unconnected and as yet unreported incidents. It was as if each person had for years harbored an odd memory or two, and until I began asking questions along lines that I knew from past experience could be fruitful, no one assumed that these memories were possibly significant, or, for that matter, part of a larger pattern within the UFO phenomenon. When, for example, I began asking the Davis family members about their dreams, especially any frightening, recurrent dreams, another previously hidden pattern emerged rather dramatically. Kathie had written to me a second time, enclosing photographs of the similar mysterious scars on her and her mother's lower legs. And in this letter, she complied with my request by describing another dimly remembered dream from her childhood. Me and my mom are hiding in a closet because there's a big thing in the sky. And Mom is real scared. Then suddenly she's pulled from the closet and I'm terrified that I'll never see her again. I don't understand why we're supposed to be scared of the thing in the sky. We lived on Michigan Street then. We were in my closet. That's it. That's all I can remember, and it's very unclear. In a later, completely separate interview with Kathie's mother, I asked Mary if she had ever had any recurrent disturbing dreams that remained vividly in mind over the years. She said that there was one puzzling dream that she had had frequently as a young woman, which was both terrifying and extremely realistic, and which involved her eldest daughter. In this dream, she had hidden in the closet of Laura's room because two people were in the house who wanted to take my child. This closet, which she dreamed of exactly as it was in reality, had a trap door in its ceiling, which led to an attic crawl space. In her panic, she opened it and pushed Laura up into the attic to hide her from the nameless threat outside. The dream always ended there, and Mary would then wake up terrified. The similarity between Kathie's and her mother's dreams is remarkable except for one odd but central detail. Kathie places herself in the dream, while Mary remembers that it was Laura she was hiding in the attic. This apparent contradiction, which still has not been resolved, can be explained various ways. First, there's the possibility of contamination. That as a small child, Kathie heard her mother's vivid account and applied it to herself rather than to her sister, Laura. Thereafter, remembering the dream as if it were her own. It is also possible that Mary misremembered her own dream, but there is a third, more disturbing possibility. When I interviewed the Davis family in Indianapolis and inquired about any odd fears or phobias any of them might recall, Laura told me that she had always had an intense fear of just such attic spaces as she remembers from their old Michigan Street home. Her own terror about it is as such that she insisted her husband nail shut the ceiling trap doors leading to attic crawl spaces in both the houses they have lived in since their marriage. Despite this deep-seated and unusual fear, Laura claims to remember nothing of a childhood attic experience, while Kathie recalls the dream of hiding with her mother in this same closet. And so, considering the recollections of all three, a third possibility suggests itself. Could there have been two separate invasions of the house years apart, with Mary reacting the same way both times by hiding her littlest child in the closet? Not until our third phone conversation did I ask Kathie if she had herself ever seen anything she took to be an actual UFO, an unidentified flying object, as opposed to the odd light in the pool shed or the two strange figures in her dream. She answered somewhat hesitantly that she and two other teenagers, had several times seen odd moving lights late at night when they were driving around, in Kathie's phrase, out in the boonies. I asked for details. My friend Dorothy and I sometimes cruised around spying on Dorothy's boyfriend. We always seemed to have a good time, but we don't remember what we did. But one time, I remember we saw this weird light. It was flashing like a strobe. I said, "Hey, look at that light up there." And then somebody said, "It's a UFO." And we all started giggling. And then it got closer, and it started flashing. We all got a creepy feeling. I was more fascinated than I was scared. I remember that we stopped the car to look at it. Kathie's memories at this point became vague. So I made a note to inquire further into this incident too. I asked her to visit her friend Dorothy and find out what she remembered about that night. And the next day, Kathie called me. "I was really surprised," she said. "When I got Dorothy on the phone, I told her you wanted to know what she remembered about the time we saw the flashing light and stopped the car. She said, 'Do you mean the light in the sky or the light on the ground that we got out to look at?' Now, the strange thing is, I don't remember seeing any light on the ground. I barely remember getting out of the car. I don't remember anything else about it at all, except that Roberta was hiding on the floor in the back seat, scared to death and wanting to go home. The whole thing was strange. I remember that I spent the night at Dorothy's and that we had barely gotten in bed when her parents' alarm clock went off and it was time for them to get up for work. I know it was almost dawn when we came in, but I can't for the life of me remember what we did all that time. Dorothy doesn't know what we did either, but she remembers how late it was. And when Kathie, recognizing the irony of the situation, chuckled and said, "I remember one of us saying, 'Time really flies when you're having fun.'" As the reader will learn, Kathie's conscious recollections of that night concealed an extremely harrowing UFO abduction experience, an event of crucial importance for our understanding of the UFO phenomenon. One of the requests I made of Kathie and her family was that they carefully go over the ground behind their house near the burned area and look for any marks or disturbances that they may not have noticed before. I also asked for samples of the soil inside the damaged circle and control samples from the undisturbed ground immediately adjacent to it. By going back to her appointment book, Kathie had been able to fix the date of the backyard events, the lights, the armed search, her mother's account of the illuminated bird feeder, etc., as having been June 30th, 1983. So my request for soil samples following the receipt of her first letter came 2.5 months after the event. I knew, therefore, that any evidential weight the samples might once have had was now probably compromised. Note: obviously, soil samples presented for chemical study 2.5 months late, as it were, could have been affected in the meantime by a variety of conditions such as weather, chemical fertilizers, and so forth. But Kathie's search at the burned circle yielded an important new find. About 2 feet out from the 8-foot diameter circle, equidistant from the center and from each other, were 4 small holes, finger thick and about 3 inches deep. These small holes, which could easily have been made by some sort of fixed symmetrical landing gear, have their precedents in other similar UFO cases, as we shall see. During a September phone conversation, one of the most disturbing series of events in the ongoing Copley Woods affair came to my attention through Mary Davis. I was speaking to Kathie one evening when she said, almost reluctantly, I thought that her mother asked her to tell me about the strange phone calls. It seems that in 1980, when Kathie was pregnant with her second son, Tommy, she received a phone call that was indecipherable. Above a background noise that roared like a factory in full swing, she heard a voice moaning and muttering, but using no syllables she could understand. She assumed at first that it was a friend playing a practical joke on her, so she broke in and asked humorously what was going on. The voice continued without even a pause to acknowledge the question. She asked again, and after several requests and no apparent response of any sort, she hung up. This occurred on a Wednesday afternoon. The following Wednesday, at about the same time, 3 p.m., she received another nearly identical call, and the next Wednesday and the one after that. No words were ever audible, and there were no apparent sexual overtones. The gender of the voice itself was indecipherable. The phone calls continued for months, coming every Wednesday afternoon at around the same time. Sometimes Kathie listened for many minutes, fascinated by the weird sounds, and sometimes she hung up quickly. At one point, early in this saga, she decided she should probably report these incidents to the telephone company and the police. But since the voice, whatever it was, seemed harmless enough, she decided not to try any legal remedies. She did, however, decide to have her phone changed to an unpublished listing. On a Monday afternoon, the telephone company called to inform her that the change had taken effect and to give her her new unlisted number. A few minutes later, the mysterious caller phoned again, sounding angry. According to Kathie, but clearly establishing the fact that acquiring an unlisted number meant nothing at all, she was as accessible as ever. It was the only time she received one of these calls on any day but Wednesday. One of the reasons Kathie's mother asked her to tell me about these calls was that Mary herself had answered the phone one Wednesday when Kathie was out. Mary said the voice had been very strange to listen to. She gave me her impression of the guttural sounds, the moans, and the background roaring and clicking noises. Both Kathie and her mother felt that the voice seemed sometimes to be angry, sometimes sad, and sometimes emotionally neutral. On one or two occasions, Kathie sensed that the sounds were actually threatening, but there was never any sense of interplay of conversation. Whatever the voice was, it proceeded in a monologue, making no allowance for any response. Luckily, on another Wednesday afternoon during that period, Kathie's friend Dorothy came to visit. She answered the phone at Kathie's request, so Dorothy too heard the moaning, the guttural noises, and all the rest. There are now 3 witnesses to this strange phenomenon, and their descriptions are remarkably congruent. The calls continued throughout the 9 months of Kathie's pregnancy, but within a week after Tommy's birth on September 26, 1980, they ceased abruptly. What is one to make of this business? Is it connected to the UFO phenomenon in some way? There are, in fact, precedents in the literature that document this kind of unusual event in other UFO situations. Note: Lucille Foreman, a woman whose UFO experiences are dealt with in Chapter 10, reports a similar event which occurred in 1973. A particularly vivid phone call account appears in Raymond Fowler's The Andresian Affair, New York Bantam, 1980, pages 195 to 99. One peripheral fact may be involved here, and it is disturbing to consider. When Kathie came to New York in the middle of October 1983, I had many questions for her. Since I routinely try to inform myself about the mental and physical health of each UFO witness, some of my questions had to do with Kathie's medical background. She has had a long struggle with several chronic, possibly psychosomatic illnesses: colitis, irregular heartbeat, acute anxiety, insomnia, and so forth. In group therapy, her psychologist thought that there was some as yet undiscovered cause for her problems, such as a buried trauma, a particular unremembered event. As she answered my questions about her medical history, I asked about the health of her 2 boys. They were fine, she said, and then paused. Tommy, my youngest, has a speech problem. He's 3 years old, but he doesn't talk yet. He just makes this sort of moaning sound. I've had him thoroughly tested. They've done brainstem and brainwave analysis and so on, and he's normal. He's very bright. He just doesn't talk yet. Later, when Kathie was alone with a woman colleague of mine, she told her, with barely concealed emotion, that the situation worried her a great deal. She said that Tommy sounds very much like the mysterious caller who repeatedly phoned her during her pregnancy. Note: in the years since 1983, when Kathie related these feelings to her friend, Tommy has made considerable gains in the control of his speech. Special training has been necessary, and though the cause of his problem is still not known, he is steadily improving. One of the earliest conversations I'd had with the Davis family concerned the 1965 missing time UFO episode reported by Kathie's sister. I spoke to Laura at length about this sighting, which the reader will remember occurred in a church parking lot, and with one chronological difference, her account closely corroborated the version Kathie had outlined in her letter. Note: Kathie had said that Laura pulled into the lot, parked, and in the daylight looked up and sighted the UFO. Actually, Laura pulled into the lot and stopped, but only later, after it had suddenly became dark, did she see the UFO above her, apparently moving away. This seems to me to be a minor, easily understandable discrepancy between the two recollections of the incident. Laura had taken her mother to a bingo party on a Sunday afternoon in the early fall. The game began at 5 p.m., so she assumes it was very close to that time when she drove by the church on her way home. She does not know why she felt compelled to pull into the entrance and then drive around behind into the church parking lot. But this is what she did. She simply stopped the car, and at this point, her daytime memories end. In the next instant, it was dark out, and above her, she could see a large, hovering UFO with multicolored lights flickering around its bottom edge. Laura could hear it humming or whirring, making a sound like a top would make, an air-like sound. She lowered her window and leaned forward to turn down the radio, hoping to hear the UFO more clearly. But suddenly, it began to accelerate and in a few seconds was out of sight. As she drove home, she realized that something was radically wrong. A portion of this puzzling sequence of events was missing, an unsettling mystery that over the years bothered her whenever she thought about it. One fascinating and suggestive new piece of information did surface during the interview. Laura told me that when Kathie was questioning her, Kathie had asked if she had been at all frightened while she was looking at the UFO. I told her I wasn't afraid at all, ever. I just felt amazed by this huge thing in the sky, only 100 feet or so above me. Kathie said, "You were never even for a second afraid?" And I said, "No, never. Not when I first saw it. Not when I heard its humming sound and watched the lights on it. And not even..." Laura said that here she stopped herself. She had been about to say, "Not even when I got back in the car." And I thought, oh, was I ever out of the car? Because I don't remember being out of the car. It was a sudden half-memory, a glimmer perhaps, but one that hinted at the forgotten part of the experience. Perhaps during the missing time period, she had been out of the car. It was an idea that opened a Pandora's box of possibilities. Later, I asked Laura if she had read my book, Missing Time, which deals with just such time-lapse situations, and she said that Kathie had lent it to her, but she had only read parts of it. "It made me very uneasy to read your book, and I couldn't finish it." She told me that she had seen Close Encounters of the Third Kind, a UFO film which does not deal directly with abductions, and said that it hadn't bothered her at all. "But when I saw the movie about the couple in New Hampshire," the UFO incident, the film account of the Betty and Barney Hill abduction, "it scared me to death. I had to turn the TV off. When I got in bed, I couldn't sleep. My eyes were wide open. I tried to sleep, and finally I thrashed around so my husband could wake up. But he never did. I hardly slept that night. I have investigated enough similar cases to recognize in Laura's account and subsequent behavior many of the signs of a traumatic and buried UFO abduction experience. Everything I was learning about the Copley Woods affair underlined my desire to go to Indianapolis and see for myself. 7 years before, I had investigated the first of scores of UFO reports that turned out to involve an abduction and which established a by now familiar pattern. In that first case, a young man, Stephen Kilbourne, was immobilized after his automobile was pulled off the road as if by some powerful external force. He was then approached by 5 short, grayish, large-headed humanoid figures. Like Kathie and so many other abductees, Kilbourne's attention was drawn almost hypnotically to his captor's eyes, which he described as really shiny, black. I don't see any pupils or anything. And they're big. They're black and endless, like they're liquid or something. I keep looking at these eyes looking at me. God, I feel like I'm under a microscope. It is worth noting that in Kathie's 1978 dream, she also describes the small gray-skinned figure's eyes as pitch black in color, liquid-like, shimmering in the dim light. When I looked at his face, his eyes, I could calm down enough to communicate. Kilbourne was taken inside the UFO and placed upon a table where he underwent an intermittently painful physical examination, which included the taking of a sperm sample. Later, he was returned to his car, and the memory of this traumatic encounter was somehow temporarily blocked. Since the Kilbourne case, I have worked directly with over 100 people who apparently have had the same kind of UFO abduction experience. These individuals, it should be pointed out, come from every educational, social, and economic level of our society. I have investigated the cases of 3 different abductees who hold PhD degrees. Other abductees I've worked with include a psychotherapist, a police officer, a lawyer for the United States government, a farmer, an army officer, a business executive, a well-known writer, an artist, a registered nurse, and so on. A nice cross-section of the community. Now, after investigating this sort of abduction account, the researcher ultimately has to take one of 3 basic positions. First, he can decide that the witness is a liar, a deliberate hoaxer. Second, he can conclude that the witness is somehow deluded, that the experiences did not physically take place, but instead was some kind of psychological aberration. The third and only other option is that the witness's account is an honest attempt to remember an actual event. As to the first option, I'm convinced that none of the apparent abductees I have worked with is deliberately trying to perpetrate a hoax. Publicity cannot be considered a motive. Only 2 of them have ever given me permission to use their real names in any report I published. None have ever asked for any reward, financial or otherwise. None, in my opinion, had any visible motive to invent such a bizarre story. And in a few cases when polygraph tests were used, the witnesses passed them. The second possible explanation of these abduction accounts, the psychological explanation, is by far the more plausible. And it is here that I have made the greatest effort to find an alternative to their literal truth. In 1981, Dr. Aphrodite Clemar, Ted Blocher, and I received financial support from the Fund for UFO Research to undertake a study of the central issue. We hired a highly recommended, highly qualified psychologist, Dr. Elizabeth Slater of New York, to administer a full battery of psychological tests to 9 people whose abduction experiences we had previously investigated, and whose veracity seemed beyond doubt. Dr. Slater was told absolutely nothing about the UFO connection. She knew only that we had a research project that required the blind testing of our 9 subjects, that we were interested in any psychological patterns that might emerge among them, and that we were interested, naturally, in any psychopathology that might be present. In June of 1983, Dr. Slater completed her tests, which included the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, the Rorschach and Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale, the Thematic Apperception Test, and a projective drawing test. She found no major mental disorders amongst the 9. None was paranoid, schizophrenic, or otherwise emotionally crippled. There was, however, something of a pattern. Though all 9 were above average in intelligence, they all shared certain deficits, to use the psychological jargon. In Dr. Slater's words, each of the 9 had a degree of identity disturbance, some deficits in the interpersonal sphere, and generally mild paranoia phenomena. I asked Dr. Slater to translate some of these phrases into layman's language for me. In general terms, though, several of the 9 subjects were extremely successful in life, in career, social and economic position, and so on. All suffered a lack of self-esteem. None seemed fully at ease physically, at home in their bodies, and comfortable with their sexuality, in Dr. Slater's words, and all suffered from a degree of distrust and wariness, though none could be called paranoid. They're just more vigilant, more hesitant to trust than the average person, she said. After Dr. Slater handed us her report, we told her about the UFO connection, and I explained a little bit about UFO abduction accounts. She was, as one might imagine, flabbergasted to find out that this was the experience her 9 subjects shared. In answer to our final request, she applied herself to the task of writing an afterword to her report, a reevaluation of the test results in the light of this new information. She read my book, Missing Time, hypnotized about the psychological effects one might expect from such an experience, and then wrote a summation. Her conclusions are extremely important for any attempt at a psychological theory of UFO abduction accounts, so I will quote from them in some detail. The first and most critical question is whether our subjects' reported experiences could be accounted for strictly upon the basis of psychopathology, i.e., mental disorder, The answer is a firm no. In broad terms, if the reported abductions were confabulated fantasy productions based on what we know about psychological disorders, they could only have come from pathological liars, paranoid schizophrenics, and severely disturbed and extraordinarily rare hysteroid characters subject to fugue states and/or multiple personality shifts. It is important to note that not one of the subjects, based on the test data, falls into any of these categories. In other words, there is no apparent psychological explanation for their reports. From another, more speculative point of view, one can consider how UFO abduction, as reported in Mr. Hopkins' missing time, might affect the victim. Certainly, such an unexpected, random, and literally otherworldly experience, during which the individual has absolutely no control over the outcome, constitutes a trauma of major proportions. Hypothetically, its psychological impact might be analogous to what one sees in crime victims or victims of natural disasters, as it would constitute an event during which the individual is overwhelmed by external circumstances in an extreme manner, and somehow stripped of any mental capacity to resist physically. Psychological traits which arose consistently in the subjects first included a surprising degree of inner turmoil, as well as a great degree of wariness and distrust. Logically, such emotional upheaval and accompanying caution about the world might certainly follow in the wake of an experience as described above. Furthermore, if one considers the skepticism and disrepute that is typically encountered with reports of UFO sightings, then not only are we characterizing UFO abduction as inherently traumatic, but we must add that it would likely carry social stigmatization as well. Assuming, for the sake of argument, that abduction has actually occurred, and that presumably its occurrence would be very rare, it then becomes something that cannot be readily shared with others as a means of obtaining emotional support. Consequently, one would likely find a deep sense of shame, secretiveness, and social alienation among the victims, who would have undergone a profound experience that could not be comprehended or accepted by others. The closest analogy might be the interpersonal alienation of the rape victim, who has been violated most brutally, but somehow becomes tainted by virtue of the crime against her. As Dr. Slater pointed out in her addendum, the results of the 9 psychological test batteries obviously cannot prove that our subjects were actually abducted. The project does, however, establish 2 major points: that a trained psychologist testing 9 individuals blindly found absolutely no psychological explanation for their abduction accounts, and also that each exhibited the kind of psychic scarring such a trauma would be likely to inflict. In my effort to explore any possible psychological explanation for UFO abduction accounts, I have dealt with a number of other psychologists and psychiatrists who have been most helpful and generous with their time. Though the subject is still so controversial, that several are not anxious to be publicly identified with the undertaking. 3 psychiatrists and 2 psychologists have conducted hypnotic regression sessions over the years with a number of possible UFO abductees. 2 other psychiatrists have interviewed our subjects and in one instance led a kind of group therapy session with a gathering of 6 abductees. None of these psychological professionals have presented to me, even tentatively, a psychological theory that might explain these bizarre accounts. And even if such a theory did exist, there would still remain the problem of explaining the physical evidence, the scars, marks, temporary disappearances, etc. It is perhaps also significant that none have ever encountered in their clinical practice any clearly psychotic patients who describe this kind of UFO abduction experience. It is obviously not a commonly held delusion. God, the devil, and the CIA are still popular. But UFO abductions are not a big item with the genuine lunatic fringe. And so we find ourselves left with the third, and so far the only undamaged explanation for UFO abduction accounts. It is at once the most incredible and yet the simplest theory of all. These clearly frightened, demonstrably honest people are simply telling the truth about what happened to them. When I completed Missing Time, I thought that more abduction accounts would continue to come to light. But I was not prepared for the truly vast numbers that apparently exist. And instead of becoming somewhat more vague in its contours, the abduction phenomenon now seems more precise, more focused, more real than I could ever have imagined. I had resolved not to write another book unless I learned some new and important truth about the phenomenon. In the intervening 5 years, that condition has been met clearly and dramatically. The impetus for this present study is my growing awareness of what seems to be a long-term specific experimental purpose behind what I had thought were the UFO's somewhat random information gathering forays. At this point, I must warn the reader once again. The assertions I am about to make are unbelievable, inconceivable. Yet, I am certain that existing evidence supports their truth. Almost everyone who has ever reported a UFO abduction experience has described the behavior of the abductors as peculiarly neutral and objective, displaying neither malice nor human warmth. The general image used by the abductees is that of a laboratory environment in which they are the tranquilized specimen. Many reports describe the taking of samples, which sometimes have included sperm and ova. In 13 cases that I have investigated, family members from different generations of the same family seem to have been systematically abducted at varying times and locations, leading one to infer that these abductions represent a genetically focused study of particular bloodlines. In the Copley Woods affair, Mary Davis was apparently abducted as a child and again as a young mother. Her daughters, Kathie and Laura, but not, it seems, her other 2 children, were abducted later at different times and places. At least 2 of Mary's grandchildren have reported disturbing encounters with similarly described humanoid figures. Both mother and daughter bear virtually identical scars on their lower legs from apparent childhood abductions. And there's evidence that both Kathie and her son Tommy have had implants inserted near their brains, one through the nasal cavity and the other through the ear. Such apparent implants, an outrageous and paranoia-inducing idea, if ever there was one, have been recalled, both with and without the aid of hypnosis, in 11 abduction cases I have investigated. The object most often described is a tiny ball, only 2 or 3 millimeters in diameter, that is put in place by means of a long needle. One remembers the analogy with human zoologists who methodically installed tiny transmitters in sample animals to facilitate later tracking. The pattern of UFO interest in generations of particular families is clear. In a Canadian case, a father was abducted as a young man, and decades later, his son experienced a series of such encounters. In an Erie, Pennsylvania family, both mother and daughter have apparently undergone the same abduction experiences over the years, while in Connecticut, Vermont, and Florida cases, mothers and sons were separately picked up and examined by UFO occupants. But most disturbing is the apparent motive behind this concentration by the UFO phenomenon upon various family bloodlines. In this book, I will present new and compelling evidence that an ongoing genetic study is taking place, and that the human species itself is the subject of a breeding experiment. I am fully aware that this idea is so outrageous that one's natural response upon reading it is to echo Justice Frankfurter's remark about the Holocaust and simply annoyance that one cannot believe it, period, regardless of the evidence. But I ask that you hear me out. If what I report in these pages is true, as I believe it is, our view of the cosmos and our place within it will be forever changed. With the stakes that high, the evidence must be attended to.